What's up, everyone? Lance Hedrick here, and I am with Scott Rao of Prodigal Coffee. I'm sure a lot of you know Scott. There's no real need for an introduction, but he is kind of the godfather in coffee, written a lot of the books that we have come to know and love that have taught us a lot about coffee. He's also pushed the boundary of what there is to know about coffee going back a few decades. So I'm pleased and excited and humbled to have Scott here as we go through a tasting together. And with you all, we'll be doing a roast defect kit. This is something Scott has been doing for some years so that you can kind of tell the difference between some common roasting defects that happen so that when you're tasting coffees, you can know if it's your brew or if it's the roast itself. Anyway, Scott, I'll let you take the floor with maybe a mini intro and, what have you.
Great to see you, Lance. I'm glad we're doing this together. So Lance is broadcasting from Portugal. I'm in Colorado. Today we are going to be cupping something we call the roast defect kit. So it consists of 3 samples of one coffee, which is honey Ethiopian called Kunkana. And there is an underdeveloped roast, a good roast, and a baked roast. Lance and I have done the roast defect kit together a few times in the past. It's a very simple but hopefully useful exercise for everyone. There's always going to be subjectivity here as far as preferences and such, but my goal with this is simply to try to get more people on the same page as far as understanding what is more or less roast development and how baking, whatever that is, because it seems to be defined many ways, can sort of decrease the fruit and the juiciness of a coffee, if you will.
Exactly.
So Lance, what I'd love to do is start with just a little bit of the logistics of the cupping, because I'm sure some folks at home have not cupped before, and I'm sure it'll be good to give people some time to prepare. So things we have here, got a couple of spoons, a spit cup, digital scale. We've got 3 cupping bowls. In my case, I pre-ground just so that I don't have to grind on camera. I've got 10 grams of each coffee ground, slightly finer than I would use for a V60 or a Kalita. I have some pretty good bottled water with an alkalinity of 30, ready to go. And Lance, tell me about your setup. Anything different for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I use these Barista Hustle cupping bowls, and I've found that when I do cupping, I like 12 grams of coffee in them, and then I fill up to the crust has a nice meniscus on it, and that's usually around 210 grams of water. So just over like a 1:17 or so ratio. I too grind a bit finer than I would for V60, maybe a little finer than Kalita. I use water sort of off the boil around 209, 208 Fahrenheit. It's like 98 or 97 Celsius. And I'm using coffee with exactly 30 alkalinity and about 80 general hardness. Then of course, cupping spoons, you want to have some bowls that you can rinse your spoons in. And when you clean the crust off, will be nice to put down. So something, if you've never cupped before, you want to have 2 spoons. And the reason is because after we break the crust, which you'll see here in a bit, you're going to want 2 spoons to kind of scrape off the floaters. So there's going to be a lot of like gaseous colloids and bits of coffee floating around. You're going to want to scrape those off so you don't slurp those. The rest of the grounds will settle to the bottom, so you won't have to worry about eating grounds during the cupping, but we will want to scrape, and having 2 spoons allows you to kind of hug them against one another and then go across the surface of the bowl to skim it. And then you can reject it into some cups that you have nearby. So yeah, other than water, coffee that's already ground up, which you go ahead and grind if you're at home and you haven't ground up yet. Go and grind them into your cups with around a 1:16 to a 1:17 ratio. Something along those lines. The SCA recommends a 1:18.18, but it really depends on it's a very odd number, but I usually stick in between 1:17, 1:17 and a half, and I find some nice results with that. But yeah, that's about it.
So before everybody grinds, I want to point out it's really good to purge the grinder between samples. So pretty much every grinder has some retention. It might be 1 gram of coffee. It might be 10 grams of coffee. It can be quite dramatic. So I would say take a very small handful of each sample, put it through the grinder, flush the grinder with that before you grind each sample, just so that there's no cross-contamination.
Yes.
And Lance, I have, from my left to right, I have coffee 1, coffee 2, coffee 3. just so that everyone's in the same orientation, left to right, 1, 2, 3.
I do too. I have left as 1, 2, and then 3. And as you notice, I did 2 bowls of each, which is just form of habit. Normally people do 2 or 3 bowls. For people at home, when you're cupping for quality, typically roasters will do 2 or 3 or more cups per coffee. And that's because when you're doing such a small sample, you want to make sure that you're getting a good representation of the whole batch of coffee. And so just out of habit, I did 2 of each.
Yep.
Why not?
Yep. Fantastic. All right. So we'll give everybody at home a moment to grind their coffee. And please, if you haven't started the water boiling yet, please turn on the kettle. Just have ample water ready so that you've got extra. So Lance, when it comes to cupping, we've got effectively 3 stages in cupping, right? We've got we pour the water, and at about 4 minutes, we do this thing we call breaking the crust. It doesn't have to be exactly 4 minutes, but that's pretty traditional. And yeah, so Lance is giving you the motion of pushing the crust away from you with the back of the spoon. Breaking the crust is an awesome opportunity to get a really good aromatic impression of the coffee. Breaking the crust releases probably more aroma than you'll ever get at any other moment in cupping. Then we clean the bowls, as Lance mentioned, somewhere around, let's say, 12 to 15 minutes into the cupping. We will do our first slurping with relatively hot, but not so hot that it would hurt your tongue, coffee. So, Lance, tell me about your slurping technique.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I do that, I saw some questions in the chat about what to grind on Pietro and ZP6 and DF64. I'll try to quickly answer those. For the ZP6, I would recommend anywhere from 4 to 4.5. Maybe 4.5 would be ideal. On the Pietro, I would recommend around a 6.5 or 7. And then for the DF64, just with that one, because so many people have them calibrated differently, just whatever you use for a V60, go like 5 notches finer than that, and you'll be good to go. Now with slurping, this is obviously the most important part of cupping, because we're trying to get an idea of what the coffee tastes like and spread it out on our tongue. So we're trying as hard as we can to aerate the coffee to cover as much of our tongue simultaneously as possible. So we want to spritz it, and that can increase our perception of the volatiles by using all our factories. And so anyway, whenever I'm going in, I kind of put the spoon right about here on my bottom lip, close to my teeth, and then I slurp through my teeth, kind of like this. It looks silly, but like that. So I'm doing it, and I always tell people, try to make it as loud as possible, not because it's the cool thing to do, but because that means you're slurping really hard. A lot of people, they get a little nervous and little tiny sips, and that's not giving you the effect you're wanting. You're wanting it to boom, spritz over your tongue, aerosolize it, if that's a word. So yeah, that's kind of the way I approach that. And then of course, closer, I'm sure you do this too, Scott, but close to the end of cupping, when it's cooled down and I've done a lot of slurping, I actually like to pick up the cup and give a little sips of it once those grounds have fully settled, so you don't get any grounds in your mouth. But yeah, just little sips at the end never hurt anyone.
Okay, sorry, Lance, my headphones are having technical difficulties. Can you still hear me okay?
Yep, everything's good.
Okay, for some reason my phone is very unhappy today. Okay. An extra thing about slurping is that, as Lance mentioned, we're trying to break up the coffee into lots of little droplets in order to coat our tongue. Breaking it up into lots of little droplets increases the surface area of the coffee a lot, so that it helps release more of those gases. I think that the 2 keys really are, slurp, even if it feels a little bit awkward, and try to hold your head straight up. Like, you notice when Lance did it that he was straight up and down. It's tempting to cup with your head bowed forward, but it's a little bit more difficult to get that same impression from slurping forcefully and coating your tongue. Okay. I think I have to put you, can I? Apologize. I need to put this. Can I put Zoom on speaker?
While he's doing that, I'll entertain you all. No, but for the people that had another question on the DF64, I I can't remember what the full range is out of, but I would say go until it's like coarse salt, like if you were to grind salt, like table salt essentially. So just grind around there and you should be good to go. Yeah, that's about as good as I can go, because I can't remember. There's so many DF64s I've used. I can't remember the number system very well off the top of my head. But yeah, salt is a good one for people at home.
Lance, I love that you've used every grinder out there, because every day I get somebody saying, what setting should I use for X grinder? And I'm like, I've never used that grinder.
It's, you know, I try. I've got an addiction, and if it helps other people that I'm a crazy person, I'm good with it.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, I got my volume problem figured out. Okay, I'm gonna click on my kettle to get closer to a boil again, and then I'll be ready to go. So for what it's worth, I'm at very high altitude. I'm at 5,000 something feet or 1,700 meters. So my water only boils at, I think, 201, 202 maybe. So my water will be a little cooler than most other people's. I don't think it has a tremendous effect on cupping, although I think that the harshness of the baked coffee could be a little bit more subdued at my brewing temperature. I find that generally speaking, when a coffee has a problem, that higher temperatures tend to magnify the problem and lower temperatures tend to hide it a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Definitely. Yeah, so just to, I guess while people are still getting things ready and we're about to pour some water, if you would talk a bit on the, like, what is going on in roasting for something to be underdeveloped and what is going on in roasting theoretically for something to be baked, I think that would help people understand a bit more what we're tasting and looking for.
Absolutely. So underdevelopment's a little easier to explain. Usually it involves simply not cooking the center of the bean enough. And there's a lot of ways to get there, right? One is maybe you roast extremely light and you're kind of trying to toe the line like a lot of Nordic roasters do, and you just miss in terms of getting enough heat to the center of the bean by the end of the roast. I would say that if you're using an air roaster, underdeveloped coffees tend to taste of twig, probably number one, corn, probably number two, and a little bit of hay or similar sort of dry, hollow flavors. And I would say in drum roasters, you get, if you have some conduction, you tend not to taste quite the corn for whatever reason. Like maybe the corn is a little too delicate and gets blunted by the conduction. But I find that with a drum roaster, you get more of like a grassy, lemony kind of acidity, if you will. Yeah. Baked is interesting because I think baked is a little bit controversial and perhaps not well understood. I think what's agreed upon with baking is that you tend to lose some of the fruit, some of the juiciness, some of the roundness of the coffee. How you get there is a good question. We've done this roast defect kit about 15, 20 times with Paulo, with his drum roasters over at Regalia. And with those, it's pretty easy to bake coffee. We tend to let the ROR flatten or rise near first crack, crash pretty hard, and then muddle along for a few seconds near zero, and then drop the coffee. And that pretty reliably produces this sort of hollow, flat, less round sort of fruit in the coffee. With the IMF, I honestly struggled with the baking because doing that same pattern doesn't produce as unpleasant of a flavor, which was interesting to find out. And the sort of hypothesis or kind of theory about what caused baking for many years. I remember in the mid 90s, I went to a roasting class with a guy named Carl Staub, who invented the Agtron color meter. And he posited that baking came from lowering the temperature around the coffee a lot, such that the sugar chains that were developing stopped developing and did this thing called cross-linking, because they weren't kind of continuing to develop due to the temperature increasing. And that this cross-linking took away sweetness and added like a flatter, kind of drier sort of flavor. Never knew whether it was true. And now I'm a little, I don't want to say I'm dubious of it. I don't really know if it's true or not. It's been the most plausible explanation for baking.
one of the difficulties I had with the IMF is that I can't lower the inlet air temperature below the bean temperature that easily. We're generally roasting at temperatures of about 700 degrees Fahrenheit or about 370 degrees Celsius. And it's not so easy to just make the inlet temperature drop, let's say below 200 degrees Celsius within a very, very short period of time. So even dropping it quite low, enough to make the ROR basically go to zero, wasn't really enough to make the coffee taste baked. And what I actually had to do was do a few tricks to get the temperature to drop extremely low, like below the bean temperature. And that triggered a little bit more of the kind of woody, hollow, flatter flavors. But it was a lot harder and took a lot more experimental coffee than I would have liked. But and I would say that the baking doesn't taste as bad as it does in a drum roaster, in part because, simply put, like, all the coffees taste a little better when you take away the conduction. So it's, I think there was like a layer of the flavor in baked coffees out of drum roasters that I wasn't sure what it was. And it wasn't part of the baking process. It was just part of the conduction that came about by doing it that way.
So to translate this to everyone who has no background in roasting, when Scott refers to ROR, this is a concept that he kind of came up with some years ago called rate of rise. And that's referring to the bean temperature as the roast continues on throughout the process. Typically, it's depicted on a graph where over time you kind of see the rate of rise will look like this. It kind of goes up and then it goes down. Now, oftentimes, what Scott's argued for a while is a steadily declining ROR, which means that rate of rise, so the rate of the temperature increase over time, is going very steadily and linearly. Now, what you'll see sometimes is that temperature goes really high really quickly and you see a crash, right? Or it kind of plateaus out. And so some of these endings of roasts can cause different unpleasant flavors. Now, some of this is what we refer to as baked. And so baked, we can't really point to when exactly it happens. You can't look at a graph and know for sure that something is baked. You can have indicators that, oh, that tastes baked. I can see why from the graph. But looking at a graph and saying that's baked is not as easy. So whenever we're talking about this, we're referring to the taste that can be imparted on a coffee. So I think the reason this is such an important practice for us homebrewers to do is that it will help you whenever you're dialing in a coffee. So you don't buy a coffee that maybe a friend says they love. You buy it and you brew it and it's not good, and you brew it and it's not good, and you brew and you brew and you brew and you're convinced you're going to get it to taste good, when in the end it may just be a baked coffee, something that's devoid of sweetness and acidity, or something that's a little bready, something that's hollow, or it might be an underdeveloped coffee, which oddly enough, you can have an underdeveloped coffee that tastes a little burnt. And that's because sometimes whenever roasters are trying to do this really light roast, they'll put a ton of heat onto the bean really, really, really quickly. And so it's kind of like you put a steak on a super hot grill and you kind of overcook the outside and undercook the inside. So it's you can sometimes have like an over-under thing, or you can have a slower application of heat and you can have a more even roast, but it could be underdeveloped, meaning it wasn't pushed as far. And so you might have these underdeveloped tastes like maybe grass or hay or wood or corn or something along those lines. And these are kind of indicators that you might have a roast defect. And it's not necessarily you need to throw your coffee away if you have a roast defect, but you might be able to find a way to make the coffee taste a little better if you know what you're dealing with, as opposed to, oh, I just need to raise the extraction in order to improve this coffee. You might go a different direction if you kind of recognize what exactly is in front of you, and it'll help you find the roasters that maybe you jive with a little bit more. Maybe there are those that flirt with underdevelopment and you really can't stand some of those underdeveloped flavors. So that might not be the risk worth taking. You may want to go with someone that might have a different predilection. So anyway, that's kind of what's going on there. ROR is rate of rise. That's what we were talking about. And this refers to graphing the temperature and the time and things like that on Cropster or on some other software that is used whenever roasters are roasting. All right, cool. So I think before we add water, let's go through and smell the dry grounds. So everyone at home that has them ground up, go ahead. You can either lean over. I'm lazy. I like to pick it up. I like to tap it to help release some of the aroma, but I like to smell the dry aroma. Get really close in there. And then if you have a pen and paper, or you can use Cupwise, you can take some notes as to what you are experiencing with that smell on the dry ones across these. So since we don't know which one each is, just make very vague remarks of it. Say, this smells like corn, or this smells like spearmint, or this smells like blueberry. Whatever word comes to mind. You could even say, this smells like pink, this smells like brown. A color, a word, a memory, anything will really work here. So don't feel pressured. I know a lot of people when they're tasting coffee, they get this like anxiety of, I have to get a perfect note. There's no perfect note. Just write down whatever pops in your head, even if it's kind of nonsensical. If it helps you describe the flavor to you, that's what we're trying to get at. So,
yeah. Also at home, please don't feel bad if you smell the dry fragrance and don't get a very strong impression. It can be really difficult, especially if coffees are lightly roasted. It's pretty difficult to smell something significant or to come up with multiple words for the aromatics from the dry.
Quick note for Vlad. Vlad, someone says that Cupwise isn't allowing adding notes. No editing is available at the moment. So yeah, Cupwise is an awesome cupping tool that Vlad, who is the one hosting this YouTube because mine decided to punk out. But those watching in the future uploaded on my channel don't know that. So let's forget that I said that. It actually was on my channel. No, not really. But Cupwise is an awesome software that we're able to use for this cupping. So feel free to use that and explore how easy that is to use in order to score coffees. It's a great skill set and a great kind of discipline to get into and really help you pour over your coffee and open up new levels of enjoyment. It's not something, you would want to do every day, but when you take in a new coffee and you're cupping it and figuring out how you want to brew it, it's a nice discipline.
Yeah. So if your water isn't currently boiled, go ahead and flick on your kettle and let's get it back to a boil. There's a few questions, but once we pour the water, we'll have a little time to answer some questions and chat about some of this. All right.
And don't share your notes in the chat. We don't want to bias other people. Thomas, you naughty person.
All right.
Yeah,
Lance, I will start a timer when we begin pouring here, okay?
Perfect.
All right. All righty.
So you want to fill quickly to those at home because you're trying to get agitation in those grounds. So don't be shy when you pour. I pour with a ton of agitation. Don't be shy with it. Get those grounds moving. I know if you have a fellow kettle, it's a little hard. Hold it at the side of the cup and it will form a vortex and that'll really help you agitate even though you don't have a fast stream. And don't worry if you're behind. This is going to be a while. We're going to let them sit for a while. You can catch up. There's no rush. Yep. And I like to do a few cups of hot water if you have some extra water for cleaning out the spoons, etc. All right, now once you have your cups ready, we can go ahead and start smelling the wet aroma as we wait for that 4-minute timer to go off. And during this time also, Scott and I can read through the chat and answer some questions. But now's a great time, right when we've applied that hot water to it. The CO2 is releasing a lot of those aromas are coming out, those early volatiles that want to come out. You want to catch those as soon as you can or they're going to be gone. So let's get to sniffing. Now, I like to get my nose as close as I can without my mustache whiskers getting into the soup. You can smell kind of like a dog, or you can just take in really controlled breaths of air, whatever, like how you smell a flower, whatever you think is the best way for you to receive. Sometimes I'll breathe in my mouth as well, because that's how I'll smell like some sort of whiskeys and things like that. And that helps me.
So Lance, something I find interesting in cupping is that sometimes right after pouring and sometimes when breaking the crust, the very first impression, this isn't really happening here, but the very first impression is kind of roasty, no matter how light the coffee is. And then after that, that goes away. I feel like when you break the crust, there's some rapidly released volatiles that relate to like a roasty flavor, but they're absolutely not there 10 seconds later. And I wish I understood what that was, because it's fascinating. It almost always happens.
You'll definitely know a little bit more. Samo has a paper coming out dealing with volatile organic compounds. It's in espresso, but we should be able to assume there's a similar trend in filter or, in more coarsely ground coffees. Some of those early releasing ones, they have identified some of those volatiles that come out, and you can actually look what are the most observed kind of flavors or smells that go along with these different volatiles. And some of them, refer to peanuts and the things that you would equate with roasting. So, interesting paper that'll be coming out soon.
Fantastic. That's I feel like we know nothing about it, and it's just basically everybody's dependent on Samo to figure it out.
Always on Samo's shoulders and giants. Now, something unique to pay attention to when we're pouring it in, and maybe I shouldn't say this because it could bias people, so maybe I won't.
Okay. Somebody asked just a couple of quick questions. So there's a score sheet on the screen. Everything goes from 7 to 10. To be honest, it's completely arbitrary. It's not an official score sheet. Why do the numbers go from 7 to 10? Merely for convenience. There's really no great reason. Most specialty coffee scores are in the mid 80s. And I feel like if we put the numbers from 7 to 10, we end up at scores that sound reasonable. Something we can kind of relate to. There's no stress, nothing serious here. Really, what I care about more is the relative numbers in the end. In other words, if people found cup 1 had a aroma of 9.5 and cup 3 had an aroma of 6.5, or 7.5 rather, that's very significant. The numbers mean nothing in terms of their level and how it relates to regular scoring and stuff like that. When we're smelling in a moment, and then when we're tasting later, there's a chance to add descriptors. And the way to do it is to add a word or a phrase and then hit the plus sign. And then you get another one, hit the plus sign. Later on, it'll generate a word cloud at the end of the cupping where we can see what the most popular or most common words were. So Lance, we're at a little over 4.5 minutes. So I think we're ready to break the crust.
So people, take your spoon. You're just going to get really close, because right when you break it, you're going to have a lot more release since there's kind of a crust form. You're going to push forward and allow that to come in. And then essentially you are agitating right now. This is going to help the extraction of the cup. So don't be gentle. Don't be shy. Get on in there like this right here. You're stirring them grounds up. Don't even worry about it. It's good for them.
Yeah, it's definitely a good idea to create a little turbulence so that you release a little more aroma. It will settle. All the grounds, all the suspended stuff will settle by the time we're ready to slurp. So don't worry too much about it.
And once you're done, obviously take notes as you're going. There's no rush here. And you can keep going back and smelling. Just because we broke the crust doesn't mean you can no longer smell it. It's still going to be giving off aroma. But when you're done, go ahead and scrape off whatever, nasties are kind of floating. We don't really want that, because we'll be sipping it in about 8 or 9 or 10 minutes or so. All right. Skimmed and good to go. There we go. Gonna refresh my waters real quick.
So Lance, since we were talking a little bit about people brewing coffee and it possibly having roast defects, I'd like to offer a little bit of advice. If you have something, this is pretty well known. If you have something you think is a little underdeveloped or too light, seal the bag, or ideally vacuum seal the coffee and just set it aside for a few weeks and come back to it. We don't really understand why, but coffee seems to taste more developed when it's rested for several weeks. So for instance, these coffees were roasted about a month ago, and this is about the right time to drink the coffee. If you think the coffee is baked, or let's say a little too roasty, you can't really fix that, but you can certainly brew with a little bit lower temperature, and you might find a little bit better balance of positive and negative flavors that's a little bit more pleasing.
Lower temperature, maybe a smaller ratio can help, spike perceived acidity a bit.
Exactly. Lower ratio. I mean, I don't do this personally, but I know some people will lower the extraction a lot by maybe grinding a little coarser or such. And I think in the case of really bad coffees, that's like, especially extremely dark coffees, that's quite helpful. But hopefully you're not needing to do that often.
I'll be honest, my hack for like, if I have an awful coffee and I just don't have anything else out, and it's like truly bad, like not like I do not enjoy it. Though my hack is what I used in compulsory for a brewer's cup, which is doing a 1-to-4 ratio on an AeroPress. So I'll do 30 grams of coffee, 120 grams of water at 80 degrees Celsius. I'll stir the mess out of it, and I will push after about a minute and a half, and then I dilute it to, about a 1.5 or so TDS, which is about 80 to 100 grams of water. And this is by far the most foolproof way of getting decent coffee out of absolute shite that I've ever done. And it's wild.
That makes sense. And it reminds me a little bit of like something like the extractamundo dose. Like it's a way of kind of decreasing risk, right? Like you're giving up on getting a 10 out of 10, but you're taking away a lot of the negative flavors and making things easier.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. So on my timer, we're just at about 10 minutes. So we'll give it a few more minutes to cool. Generally speaking, it's a little bit easier to differentiate the roasting problems when the coffee is cooler than when it's hot. And let's see. Okay. So any questions on here? Okay. For what it's worth, if anyone's having trouble with the score sheet, I was actually having a little trouble. I was using Brave browser, but I switched to Chrome, and all the problems went away. Cupwise seems to work best with Chrome if you have it and you're having any problems.
Now, Scott, before we continue on, I think this would be a really illuminating kind of bit to hear from you. But I think something that might be confusing people is we're referring to, like, when we talk about underdeveloped, then developed well, then baked, people might be conflating that to light, medium, dark. So could you talk on how baked is not necessarily dark, but also dark could be baked, but dark doesn't have to be baked?
Totally. No, that's a really good point. And okay, and like you mentioned before, a coffee could be pretty dark on the outside and pretty light on the inside. So although underdeveloped is usually with very light roast, it doesn't have to be. For instance, like if you were to take a drum roaster and roast really fast, like 4 minutes or something like that, you would probably end up with like roasty flavors on the outside and underdeveloped flavors on the inside.
Yeah.
Baked is generally something that has to do with how you got to the end of the roast, not how dark you are. Yep. So it's a little bit of like I said before, maybe it has to do with those sugar chains or not, but generally speaking, if the rate of roasting, if the rate of rise drops precipitously and the temperature around the beans drops very quickly, later in a roast, you might end up messing up some of the roundness and the juiciness of the fruit. Doesn't mean that the coffee is dark. Yeah. And so those are, I don't want to say they're mutually exclusive, but you can basically have light or dark and baked or underdeveloped, or some combination, but they're not. It's not like baked is always dark or anything like that. Exactly. And to some degree, there's something subjective here in the sense that I would call the underdeveloped cup. I would say it tastes a little bit like hay. But there's other people who love what they would call like the transparency of the cup. They're going to say, you know what, like that doesn't bother me. I love that the flavors are so delineated. I don't care how much body there is. I don't care how juicy it is. I like this sort of delicate, clear flavors, and I'll live with the hay or that kind of thing. So,
sure. Yeah.
There's always subjectivity to it. I always get people arguing about it, and I totally get it. It's more like, I think it's more about like meta awareness. Like if you're someone who, when we first started Prodigal, someone who likes extremely like roasted coffee was angry that we were roasting darker than he liked, and I was like, look, it's totally fine. I get that everyone's got different tastes, but if you're like in the 1% of 1% who like the lightest possible roast, you have to be a little bit aware that that's who you are as a consumer. And that most people are not going to roast to the degree that you want. Okay, so we're at 13 and a half minutes, so I think it's a good time to slurp. So everybody just know that any words and scores that you enter will get aggregated later, but it's all anonymous. So feel free to just throw some words in there. Don't worry at all. There's no stress. There's no pressure on this.
Yes, you could put in, Fancy Lancy or Silky Milky or something like that. Completely okay. So if it's your first time slurping, do not overfill your spoon. Okay, just take a little bit and get a feel for it, and then as you feel, you can add a little bit more. But the idea is we're really wanting to spritz it, aerate it.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a great point. And like half spoonfuls are somehow a little bit easier to handle when you're slurping.
And if it's later for you, maybe have a spit cup. I just go hard, so I'm not spitting. I'm just gonna take the caffeine. So, all right.
Yeah.
And sorry if you have misophonia. That's this probably isn't a great life for you. So take your time over each one. And then what I like to recommend people do is whenever you're switching from one cup to another, don't necessarily try to think of the cup as a whole while you're comparing it. Look for small things to compare. Like if you notice a specific flavor in one cup, see if you can get it in the next cup. Then if you notice a specific flavor in the next cup, go back to the first and see if you can get it. Try to get as pointed as you can, and that's going to really help you be able to tell differences a bit more than trying to as opposed to trying to judge the cup as a whole. A lot of people come in and they're like, all right, I'm gonna tell all 12 flavors at once, and then I'm gonna pit it against the 12 flavors in this. That gets way too difficult. Don't do that. Zone in on things that you are that are right in front of you. All right. So as you're tasting, what's the most obvious thing? Now go to the next cup. Is that obvious thing there, or does it have a different obvious thing? Note those differences as you keep sipping each cup as it cools. Then, of course, all taste is memory, right? Like we can say something tastes like blueberry. Obviously, it's not like anyone can taste it and they're going to taste blueberry. It's connected to a memory that you have of tasting blueberry. You're not going to be perfect in a recollection right now. If I said, imagine what watermelon tastes like, you won't be able to have a perfect recollection, even if you eat it every day. It's going to be a memory of what that tastes like. That's essentially what we're looking for when we're cupping. We're looking for memories of tastes that we have experienced. So if you have a memory of a cucumber when you take a slurp, or a bell pepper, write that down. Even though those may not be the most ideal notes in a cup, if you get that, write it down. If you get soy sauce, if you get vinegar, it doesn't matter what you get. Don't think that you're crazy for getting something. These are all very, very legitimate things you could be getting in a cup of coffee, depending on the process, depending on the variety, depending on a lot of different things. So whatever that comes to your mind, whether that's coal, whether that's butterscotch, whether it's panela, molasses, syrup, honey, whether it's white flour, blue flour, whatever it is, you can make something up. It doesn't matter. But if you have some sort of memory or some way of connecting it to a flavor. That's what matters here. And then keep noting it as the temperature goes down. As the temperature dwindles, you'll be able to taste more and more of these evolving flavors in the cups. So that's what's really important is as the cup is sitting here, it's changing its character drastically. So obviously the stable acids aren't changing, but your perception of them will change. And the volatile organic compounds will be releasing throughout the entirety of this. So maybe as summer is releasing, it's going to show off another acid or something that might have been covered up earlier. But also, as we're sitting here, just your perception at different temperatures is going to change. So whereas the chemical structure isn't really changing, your perception will change with the differing temperatures.
Yeah, different volatiles are released at different temperatures. Mm-hmm. And I find that worst roasts sometimes taste pretty good hot, but show themselves later when it's cooler. If you've done cupping before, you might have noticed that some coffees reliably start tasting a little hollow after about a half hour, but weren't quite as hollow in the beginning. And those always point to something roast related, not green related. Okay. Someone asked, what if I drop the temperature aggressively at the very end in favor of nearly 100% airflow? Like many things, it depends on what machine you're using, because increasing the airflow can accelerate a roast a lot. And so you might be, like if you're using an air roaster and you drop the inlet temperature and increase the airflow simultaneously, you may have neutralized both of those changes with each other. If you're using a drum roaster, depending on how hot the burner temperature is when you increase the airflow, you might accelerate or decelerate a roast. So it's never as simple as what if I do X, because it kind of depends on the conditions in the machine when you make that change.
Yeah.
Okay. So Lance, we're at about 20 minutes. I'm pretty comfortable talking about the coffees now. And if you're at home, I think it's perfectly fine to keep slurping, keep taking notes. Again, no pressure on anything, but you can kind of add to your notes if you wish. But Lance, how about we go through 1, 2, 3 together?
Yep, absolutely. So at home, slurp with us, let's be communal. We got people all over the world doing this.
That's right. So Lance, I think one is my favorite cup, not in terms of quality, but in terms of what it does, what it shows. Because there's really nice orange and peach in the cup, but there's a very obvious hay and like twig sort of flavor. Yes. And I think somebody could easily taste this and love it. But I think it shows that, very clearly there's good flavors, and then there's these like under-ish flavors that are not horrible flavors, but they're in the way of it being super clean, super juicy.
Yeah, exactly. There's definitely like a little bit of straw-like, hay-like thing. And on the end, there's a bit of vegetal that comes up. But overall, there is like a creamsicle type thing going on in the main part of the cup that I actually quite enjoy. And there is like a nice, I wouldn't say it's extremely vibrant, but there is a slight vibrancy to it that I was a little shocked on just based off of looking at the color of the bean itself. So there, I think it's a solid cup, but it's definitely lacking. I think it's lacking sweetness and lacking body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, body is low. I think the acidity is excellent. I actually gave it the highest points for acidity. But I mean, it's winey. It's relatively crisp. And it's a good cup in many ways. It's one of those things where on a macro level, like, body, acidity, aroma, like it's pretty good. But on a micro level, there are unpleasant flavors. I know the numbers are a little bit arbitrary, but going through them, I gave it 8 for aroma, 9 for acidity, 8.5 for sweetness, 8 for balance. I felt the balance was pretty off on this, especially because the body is very light. And I gave it 9 for clean cup because it is quite transparent, if you will.
Exactly. No, I agree with that. I forgot where I put my tab. Yeah. Anyway, I forgot to fill out a score sheet, to be honest with you. So it is what
no
it
problem.
is. I was sitting here talking while you were scoring.
No, it's good. You're doing your part, and the scores aren't that important. All right, let's do cup number 2.
Yep. This one's more velvety. It has a much more structured body, and there's actually some, oddly, there's like a white grape that comes out that was not at all present in the first cup, just like a little deeper sweetness and a deeper kind of acidity there that is actually really pleasant. Yeah, the acidity was a bit sharper, I guess, in the first cup, but it's more tame here. So it's more like the difference between an unripe raspberry and then like a really ripe blueberry, I guess, something like that. But yeah.
I would say the acidity was definitely better in the first cup, but this has what I would consider like more depth, more sweetness, more balance.
Yeah.
And again, like I could totally see someone loving cup 1 for its crispness and clarity. Although I would get a little tired of the hay-like type flavors. But cup 2 is a little more settled, a little plumper. The finish on this doesn't have that vegetal type finish going on.
Right. It's actually got like a nice citrusy, like citrus blossom finish, which is nice.
So I would say one way I think of it is sometimes when you roast to avoid the rough edges, like cup 3 and cup 1 have a little bit of rough edges for me. When you avoid the rough edges, sometimes you lose something along the way, right? Like you might have to lose a little acidity or something like that to tame things and kind of make the coffee a little bit rounder. And I think that's why, some people prefer light, they prefer dark, things like that. Yeah. But as far as something I could say, drink a whole mug of or drink all day, I would gravitate toward cup 2.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to be sure for people watching, when we say, when we talk about underdeveloped, that's obviously a relative term. And so under was just more so whenever these flavor notes come out of this hay or these type of things we've been discussing. And so it's completely valid to enjoy a coffee that has those notes, but just know that when we're talking about under versus developed versus well-developed versus whatever, that we're not talking about merits of good or bad, but more so describing typical flavors that might accompany those terms.
Totally. And it's not a value judgment, as you're saying. I mean, it's, you could love very light, you could love very dark. It's more like if you get the hay or straw type flavors, and you could think of it as like what would be classically underdeveloped, and you're welcome to love it, right? It's not there's no judgment on that.
Yep.
All right, cup. So for this one, my scores were, I gave it very good scores for aroma. I really loved the aroma because there was like a nice floralness in here that wasn't quite as prominent in the other ones. Gave it 9.5 in aroma versus 8 for the cup 1. The acidity went down from 9 to 8.5. The sweetness was the highest of the bunch. I gave it 9.5. I thought the balance was there too, also 9.5. And clean cup, I also gave 9. I feel cup 1 and cup 2 are both clean, but in sort of different ways. Cup 1 has a little more transparency. Cup 2 has less rough edges, if you will.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, it was shocking. I actually, normally with really light roasts, I get a lot of florality. Out of these, there was more present florality in this one, I think, than in the first cup. First cup had more acidity, but this one, it was almost like that acidity was kind of pushing out the potential for florality. This one, I got like some nice violet, lilac, things like that. And,
yeah, I was a little surprised by that as well. Usually when you're about to sample something underdeveloped, you're like, wow, that smells good. And then you dive in and you're like, oh, there's hay or corn or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, this time somehow the aroma of cup 2 was slightly superior. I'm going to take a few slurps of cup 3.
Shockingly, based off of what I was seeing in the cup, especially whenever I ground it and looked at the the bloom of it. This has a lot more acidity than I would have guessed, but it is still lacking in comparison to the other two, obviously. And there's quite a bit of a like smoky charcoaly type finish, almost as if it was in a conductive roaster.
That's actually, Paolo tasted it and he made a similar comment. I don't quite taste conduction, but I do get a flavor that I sometimes call lemon bark. It's like you get this good acidity, but you get this sort of like burnt tree bark flavor that is faint, but it's there. And it wasn't a particularly dark roast. I mean, the weight loss on the baked was, I think, 12.0. The weight loss on the good was like 11.5, and the weight loss on the under was like 10.9. So they are different, but really, for most roasters, that's like standard tolerance, like a half point. So it's quite interesting that it managed to take on a little bit of a roasting flavor.
Yeah, it's very, very odd coming from an IMF.
I get a bit of a, like, for lack of a better word, like a very muddled flavor on 3. Like the clarity is gone to some degree, especially as it cools.
More blended.
Mm-hmm. I get a mushy.
It's much more drying. It's much more drying.
It is, which is also a little bit unusual. I got some astringency on this one. I got a very much a toast flavor, like like not quite burnt toast, but if 1 was maybe a little bready, 3 is like a little bready, but more like toasted bread. And the peach was still there. Like the acidity is kind of lemony, but there's hints of wood and there's like less clarity of flavor in 3.
What's interesting is there's a high minerality in this. It's like a mineral water, which normally
that's a good word.
Which also comes along with lighter roasts. I actually really like minerality, and it actually makes this a bit more taste, a bit more palatable. Only because minerality, when I get it in coffees, tends to be a pretty long aftertaste note, and so this one initially I get hit with that kind of burnt flavor, but that minerality kind of stays in as if I had just drinking some high mineral water.
Mineral is a great term for this. It reminds me a little bit of, like, I really like Riesling wines, and some Rieslings are like very fruity and then some are very minerally, and it's like you kind of can't have both at the same time. Really. There's a little bit of a spectrum there. On this one, I felt that all of the attributes were a little bit tamed. Like the aroma was 8.5. The acidity was the lowest at 8. The sweetness was 8. Balance was 8. Clean cup was 8. So on the just below average on most of those attributes. Someone made the note that he enjoyed cup 1 at first a lot, but then as it cooled, the vegetal flavors kind of showed up, and then he kind of preferred cup 2. Andrew says, I think in reference to cup 3, he says his cup was flat, boring, and peanutty. Andrew, if you get peanut, it's almost always a Quaker. We did some optical sorting on these, but it is difficult to get all the Quakers out. And if you ever want to know what Quakers taste like, save a bunch of Quakers, brew a cup of Quakers. You'll never forget what it tastes like again.
It's actually a great thing to try. I would highly recommend sorting out Quakers when you get bags. You're going to find a lot of Quakers, even in high quality Ethiopias, especially anything that's not washed. They tend to slip by pretty easily. And so this is a honey Ethiopia. You're going to find Quakers even with optical sorting.
Even with very expensive coffees, like we're literally sometimes pulling out anywhere between 5 and 20% Quakers, depending on the coffee. And it's always peanutty. And it's also drying. Like, at the astringency in this one, actually come to think of it, like I might have had 1 Quaker in my cup, and that might have contributed to the dryness. Quakers, I've learned a couple of interesting things about Quakers recently, Lance. One is that if a coffee doesn't have any Quakers, the aftertaste will be wet and lingering. And if it has even 1 Quaker, the aftertaste will just hit a wall and stop. The aftertaste dries up. And I never knew it was purely due to Quakers, but we've done enough Quaker, no Quaker experiments to realize that that's what causes the aftertaste to come and go. The other thing is, how people always say that Brazilian coffees are kind of chocolatey and nutty? I took a bunch of Brazils, removed 100% of the Quakers, and all of the nuttiness went away. And
Wow.
I think due to the kind of color tone of Brazils and the fact that people tend to roast them slightly darker, usually for espresso, it's pretty hard to identify and find and remove all the Quakers.
Yeah,
and I haven't noticed any peanutty or nutty flavors in Brazils once all the Quakers are removed, which is interesting because Brazils tend to have a lot of Quakers and people tend to universally think of it as nutty coffee, but I actually think it's not.
Yeah, Quakers can also taste kind of like oats. So it's like oats and peanuts. They're weird things that you definitely want to get out of your coffees. And I talk about it in previous videos about removing Quakers. Now for people, as if you still have more coffee, go back and try cup one now that it's a lot cooler. The vegetalness has really cranked up, as the commenter was saying to Scott that he read aloud. It is way more vegetal now. I also wanted to, that was just a quick thing. What I wanted to address is someone has been asking about why we resent out some bags. Originally in the first round, essentially, the two not great roasts were roasted a little bit better than we intended. And so the resend out was a little worse roasts purposefully, right, so you can actually have a bigger difference and be able to see what under would actually mean. The original under was tasting pretty good and the baked wasn't that bad. So we were like, all right, let's pivot.
That was my bad. It sounds bad, but like it's a little bit difficult to screw up the coffees to the degree that I want in this machine. And some people tasted it and generally got the 1, 2, 3 right. Like Luca, of course, like tasted them and knew which was which. But we really needed. I think this is a more appropriate amount of contrast in this cupping, and I feel much better about this one. But that's a great point about cup one. Cup one now has lost most of its charm. Yes. Which is quite interesting.
Well, cup 3 now has like a rhubarb thing going on in it, and it's actually getting better as it's cooling down. Like most of a lot of that roastiness has kind of gone away as it's cooled, and the acidity's kind of a bit. It's not great, but it is better. So it's interesting how the really light one has gotten kind of worse as it sat here, and this one's kind of improved for me at least.
Yep. Cup 3, the woodiness I find is getting more prominent as it cools. There's like the wood and toast in 3 is to me a little more prominent than it was before. Hey Vladimir, can you lock and average all of the scores now? Okay, so assuming Vladimir is still with us, we're going to be able to stare. So if you take a look at your screen, if you don't see this, you can refresh your screen, but you should see gray scores as well as the pink purple scores that you personally put in, and then you should see the word clouds. So the way this works is that the grayed out scores, you can see little bar graphs to see what the most popular frequency is of each score. So like for instance, on sample 2 acidity, you can see that between 8.25 and 8.5 was the most popular, 8 to 8.25 was next popular, etc. Interesting, and this is actually a really great thing to see. Cup 1, there were a few outliers that gave Cup 1 9 to 10 for 9.5 to 10 for clean cup, which I think was really interesting because nothing else got a 10 for clean cup. And the acidity was also scored highest in Cup 1, but you can see that the averages for sweetness, for instance, blew away the other ones. Like Cup 2 is the highest in sweetness, and balance as well. So this is, again, the numbers themselves mean nothing, but the relative numbers are actually really well done here. Hay, good. Peach, orange, twig, wood. Okay, I'm seeing, Vladimir, I'm seeing my own descriptors. I'm not seeing other people's descriptors. Let me see if I can make everybody else's show up here. Oh, there we go. Okay, now, if you don't see this, you can refresh, but you should see about 100 words in each word cloud. And in Cup 1, hay was the biggest word. Dry was pretty big and repeated, and then blueberry and sweet and berries was there. Cup 2, citrus, and then fruity, and then chocolatey. And Cup 3, roast, intense fruitiness, A little bit of dark, dry, bright, dry. So kind of gross. Interesting.
I love that, though.
Okay. Excellent.
For people that are asking, just so you do know, bag number one is underdeveloped. Bag number 2 is proper. Number 3 is baked.
Oh, sorry. Yes, of course. And okay, so you will be able to view this video anytime you want on Lance's YouTube after he saves it in a few minutes from now. I really appreciate, Lance, your time and participating in this with me. And thank you to everyone at home for cupping along with us. Feel free to send a message on Instagram to either one of us or anywhere else if you have some comments or concerns. Yeah, thanks to everyone. Thanks, Vladimir, for your help with the Cupwise as well. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And on a final note, for people who are wanting to improve their tasting ability or improve their taste perceptions or improve just what they're doing at the table, it's very simple. Go to your local markets of all different ethnicities and buy up all the fruits that you've had before and that you've never had before. Buy some weird vegetables and just eat them with intention. Don't just, yum, these are good, I'm just going to scarf them down. Eat them and think and eat and think. What you're trying to do is create memories of those. And then maybe go get some coffees from a roaster that maybe you really trust, you really like the coffees of, and you think that they do a good job with their notes. And maybe pair some fruits or foods with the coffee, with the notes that they're calling on it. Drink some of the coffee and see if you can kind of match up what's going on. Now, this is, again, it's just a practice. There's no perfect way to really improve this. And again, when I say improve, I haven't said this yet. When I say improve, everyone's taste, you're not improving your taste. You're just expanding your lexicon and your capability to match a word to a word. All right. You're matching an experience to a coffee. That's all we're trying to do, is we're creating pathways to things that are already existing. So whenever you're trying to work on your taste, you're not going to it's not like going to a gym and getting bigger muscles. What you're just doing is creating new pathways between something you've tasted and something you're currently tasting and putting them together. So you want to work on your memory, your taste memory. So get weird fruits, go to things that get foods you've never gotten before and taste them with intention. And I promise you, this is going to get you going. Get passion fruits, dragon fruits, get anything, essentially just whatever fruits you've never had before, kumquats, whatever it might be. Try them, eat them, get different veggies, maybe look at the SCA flavor wheel. And if you've not tried something on there, try it out. Just wherever you can see a conglomeration of tastes that are potential in coffee, try it. Be intentional about it. Try to remember it. And then as you're tasting coffee, just let the colors and the memories kind of overcome you and write down whatever comes to mind. Just write it down. Get in that habit and you will become a better taster. I say better because it's relative. But yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, Scott, for doing this with me. Again, sorry to everyone on the streaming weird stuff, but we had it and I think it was a good time. I hope that this was a successful and helpful and educational process for you all. But I guess until next time, I hope that you brew something tasty.
Thanks, Lance. Take care.
All right. Cheers.